At the dinner table, his son's wife leaned forward, her smile razor-thin, and spat out the unthinkable. This was his last meal in their home, and come Monday, he'd be dumped in a nursing facility. The room went silent, the air thick with cruelty, as if decades of sacrifice could be erased with a single sentence. Viewers will feel the knife twist of betrayal in every word, the humiliation of a father reduced to a burden. Subscribe now and comment where you're watching from, because what happens after this dinner will leave everyone stunned and desperate to know more. After Margaret's funeral, the house turned into a mausoleum of memories. The scent of her lavender lotion lingered in the hallway, her teacup sat chipped on the kitchen counter, and the rocking chair on the porch still creaked with the wind as if waiting for her weight. Every sound was louder in her absence, the ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint rattle of pipes in the night. Each reminded him not of life but of the void she left. He tried to sit in the den where they had watched late-night news together, but the chair across from him sat empty, its silence louder than any broadcast. He tried to cook dinner only to burn toast because she was not there to tease him about being a terrible cook. The walls had become his captors, and every photo frame pressed down on his chest like a stone. It was his son Michael who suggested he move in. "Dad, you don't need to be alone in that house," Michael said, his voice low and heavy, as if compassion could be rehearsed. For a brief moment, hope cracked through the grief. Maybe sharing a roof again would soften the ache. Maybe being around family, around his granddaughter Lily, would remind him of warmth. He sold the house, packed only the essentials, and clutched Margaret's rosary in his pocket as the movers carried away the life they had built together. That house had been theirs for 42 years. Leaving it behind felt like burying her all over again. Michael's home looked promising on the outside, all neat hedges and fresh paint, the kind of suburban dream his generation never had. But inside, the air was different. Rachel, his daughter-in-law, gave him a smile that didn't touch her eyes, a smile that stretched like plastic wrap over something rotten. She gestured toward the guest room and said, "Make yourself comfortable." The words were polite, but her tone carried a warning, temporary. The first weeks passed quietly. He rose early, still waking on Margaret's schedule, making coffee that no one drank but him. He watched Lily before school, braided her hair the way Margaret had taught him, and listened to her chatter about teachers and friends. In those mornings he felt almost alive again. But by evening the house turned cold. Rachel sighed when he lingered too long in the kitchen. She closed doors a little harder when he watched TV in the living room. One night he heard her whisper behind a closed door, her voice sharp as glass. "He can't stay forever." Michael never said much. He was busy with work, late nights at the office, phone calls that bled into dinner. When his father tried to talk, Michael nodded absently, eyes already on emails. The man who once held his hand across busy streets, who once begged him to play catch in the yard, now treated him like an obligation. The bond they once had cracked beneath the weight of Rachel's disdain. The loneliness followed him into their home, not eased but magnified. He felt like an intruder in a space that should have been sanctuary. Evenings stretched into hollow hours, him sitting alone in the dim guest room, the sound of laughter rising faintly from the other side of the house. He stared at the ceiling, tracing shadows, listening to the hum of the heater, and wondered if this was what it meant to grow old, to fade in the background of lives you helped build. Then came the subtle shifts. His framed photo of Margaret, the one he placed on the dresser, disappeared one day. When he asked Rachel, she shrugged. It didn't fit the decor. His books, worn and underlined from years of use, ended up in boxes in the garage. His chair at the dining table was nudged closer to the wall, not quite part of the circle. Each act was small, almost invisible, but together they stripped him of presence, of identity, until he was no longer a father or grandfather, but simply another mouth to feed. He clung to Lily's affection like a lifeline. She still ran to him after school, still asked him to tell stories of when her dad was young, still curled beside him with a blanket as he read aloud. But Rachel's eyes followed every moment, her patience thinning. "Lily has homework," she snapped one night, pulling the girl away. The door closed, and the silence that followed was sharper than any words. The grief that had once been tied to Margaret's absence now braided itself with humiliation. He was no longer just a widower. He was a burden in his son's home. He tried to swallow the pain, to remember Margaret's gentle voice urging him to stay calm, to stay kind. But every whisper he overheard, every look Rachel gave, every empty nod from Michael dug deeper. He began to notice the brochures. Glossy pages tucked onto the counter slipped into the mail pile left on the coffee table. Smiling seniors playing cards, swimming in pools, strolling through manicured gardens. The names of facilities blurred together, but the message was clear. They were preparing a future for him, one where his choices didn't matter, where he would be cataloged and stored away. Late at night, he sat by the window staring at the moonlight stretching across the street and thought of Margaret. She would have fought for him, would have told Rachel exactly where she could shove her brochures, would have reminded Michael what loyalty meant. He whispered her name into the dark, as if she might answer, as if she might give him the strength to endure. But strength wasn't enough. The loneliness gnawed at him in ways grief never had. Grief was sorrow for what he had lost. This was sorrow for what he was still losing: his dignity, his place in the world, his son's love. It wasn't death that frightened him, it was erasure. So he smiled when Lily asked for stories, when neighbors waved from across the street, when Michael muttered goodnight without looking up from his phone. He smiled because that was what Margaret would have wanted. But inside something hardened, something sharper than grief. He realized he was no longer waiting for acceptance. He was preparing, and as he lay in that guest room listening to the faint creak of the house that wasn't his, he knew one thing for certain. The betrayal at the dinner table had only been the beginning. What came next would make them regret underestimating him, and it would change everything. He signed away the deed to the only house he had ever called his own, the place where every corner still whispered Margaret's laughter. The papers slid across the lawyer's desk, crisp and final, and in return, $300,000 shifted into Michael's account with the promise of transformation. "We'll build you a proper suite." "Dad," Michael had said, his voice smooth with reassurance. "A private bathroom, a sitting room, even a little patio where you can drink your coffee in the mornings. You'll have your own space, but you'll never be alone." The words glowed with hope in the moment, and the father chose to believe them. He chose to believe that family meant something, that a son would never exploit his father's grief. Weeks passed, and the sound of hammers and saws never came. Instead, the low rumble of a new SUV engine filled the driveway, gleaming black under the afternoon sun. Rachel posed beside it, snapping pictures, her smile wide as she angled her sunglasses just right. "It's perfect for us," she told the neighbors, bragging about the leather interior, the upgraded stereo, the smooth ride. Michael grinned as if he had earned it, as if the money had been his all along. The father stood at the window, watching the shine of his sacrifice reflect back at him, each beam of light, another reminder of promises already broken. Inside, no walls were torn down, no foundations poured, no blueprints unrolled on the kitchen table. Instead, the conversation shifted whenever he asked. "Contractors are hard to pin down right now," Michael said, tapping at his phone, not meeting his father's eyes. "Prices are through the roof. We need to be smart about timing." Days bled into months, and the excuses piled up like dust in the corners of the unfinished dream. The father noticed how quickly mortgage statements disappeared from the counter, tucked away as if their weight was too shameful to reveal. He noticed how Rachel avoided the subject entirely, changing the topic to Lily's piano lessons or the rising cost of groceries. The betrayal wasn't loud, not yet. It was a quiet erosion, the slow theft of trust dressed in polite conversation. He sat at the dinner table, his chair always slightly askew, listening to Michael discuss interest rates with the same mouth that had once promised safety and care. He thought of Margaret and the mornings they had planned their future, how she had trusted him to protect what they had built together. He imagined her voice, now sharp and clear, cutting through the fog of deceit. "Don't let them take everything." Nights grew colder. He lay awake in the guest room, the ceiling pressing down on him like a lid, and wondered how $300,000 could vanish so quickly. He had built that wealth brick by brick, working overtime shifts, saving pennies when the children were small, watching Margaret stretch every dollar into meals and school clothes. And now, in the span of months, it had been swallowed by debt and vanity. The taste of it was bitter, the kind that lingers no matter how much water you drink. He began to keep notes, small scribbles, in a worn ledger he carried in his pocket. Dates, purchases, half-heard conversations. The SUV's registration number. The mortgage company's logo on envelopes. He wrote not in anger but in precision, the way he once balanced books for clients who trusted him to guard their futures. Each entry was a stone in the foundation of something larger, something Rachel and Michael would never see coming. Still, he kept his face calm. He smiled when Lily showed him her drawings, when Michael asked for another loan to cover unexpected bills, when Rachel complained about the cost of private school. He smiled because silence was his weapon. He had learned in his years of work that the man who speaks least often knows the most. And what he knew now was this: their greed had blinded them, and in that blindness, they had underestimated him. One afternoon he found himself alone in the kitchen. On the counter sat an unopened letter from the bank, its edge torn just enough to reveal a balance due. He slid it open, reading the numbers that screamed louder than words. The house he had helped finance was already drowning, the payments stretched thin, the new car loan an anchor dragging it deeper. They had not just stolen his money, they had chained themselves to debt with it. He folded the letter carefully, slid it back where he found it, and returned to his room with the faintest flicker of satisfaction. The promises of comfort had turned to ash, but in the ash he saw the outline of opportunity. He began to think not of what he had lost, but of what he could still control. The ledger grew heavier with each passing week, pages filled with their lies, their extravagance, their weakness. He remembered Margaret's rosary still tucked in his pocket, and felt the weight of it like a compass pointing forward. As winter crept in, the atmosphere in the house thickened. Rachel's tone sharpened, her patience thinner by the day. Michael grew more distant, his voice brittle when money was mentioned. Lily remained the only light, but even she was shielded now, her visits cut short by her mother's interruptions. The father watched it all with quiet eyes, every moment feeding the resolve hardening inside him. And then one evening, as the wind howled against the windows and the SUV sat gleaming in the driveway like a monument to betrayal, he realized the truth. They thought they had cornered him, but they had only trapped themselves. They had revealed every weakness, every crack in their foundation, and he was the only one patient enough to see it. The night was long, but his mind was sharper than it had been in months. He no longer felt like a widower crushed by loss. He felt like a man standing at the edge of something vast and inevitable. The betrayal was complete, but so was his clarity. What they had taken from him in promises he would reclaim in silence and precision. And as he closed his ledger, sliding it beneath the mattress, where no one would think to look, he whispered into the dark. Not to Margaret this time, but to himself. The reckoning hasn't started yet. What came next would not just reclaim his dignity, it would turn their entire world upside down. It began with silence at the dinner table, the kind that feels deliberate. One night the plates were already scraped clean, wine glasses rinsed and tucked into the dishwasher when he stepped out of his room at the smell of roasted chicken. Rachel glanced up, her smile tight, and said, "Oh, I thought you were resting." Her words hung in the air like a dismissal, and she didn't offer a plate. He poured himself a glass of water instead, sitting alone as the echo of their laughter lingered down the hall. The pattern repeated. Meals became whispers behind closed doors, and his seat at the table was slowly forgotten. His belongings began to migrate. The photo of Margaret, the one framed in mahogany that once sat on the mantel, vanished. In its place stood a decorative vase Rachel had bragged about finding at an estate sale. His books, the ones he had read to Michael as a boy, ended up in cardboard boxes stacked by the garage door. A jacket he had left on the back of the couch disappeared into the laundry room, folded neatly but never returned. The message was clear. This was not his home, only a place he was allowed to stay. The living room told the story best. Once his presence had been part of it, a photo of him and Margaret on their 25th anniversary, a portrait of him holding Lily when she was born. One by one, those images disappeared. In their place came staged family shots of Michael, Rachel, and Lily. 3 smiles carefully posed under perfect lighting, as though the grandfather had never existed. He stood there one evening, staring at the empty space where his wedding portrait once hung, feeling the slow erasure of his life from their walls. Rachel's gestures were small, but their intent sharp. When guests came over, she introduced the house as if it were only hers and Michael's. "We've done so much with the space," she'd say, ignoring the man sitting quietly in the corner. She'd laugh about Lily's school, about vacations they planned, all without acknowledging the sacrifices that had made any of it possible. Her voice dripped with the satisfaction of control, and the father felt himself fading in the background, a ghost walking among them. Michael noticed, but never intervened. He buried himself in work, coming home late, offering only distracted nods when his father tried to speak. Once, in a rare moment of honesty, the old man asked, "Do you even see what she's doing?" Michael shifted uncomfortably, eyes on the floor. "She's just adjusting, Dad. It's not easy having another person here." The words cut deeper than if he had agreed outright. Adjusting. As if years of devotion of raising him through lean winters and long summers could be reduced to inconvenience. Lily was the only one who resisted the tide. She still slipped into his room with her sketchbook still curled against him when thunderstorms rattled the windows. Still whispered secrets she trusted no one else with. But even her innocence couldn't shield him from Rachel's tightening grip. More often, Lily was pulled away with a stern, "You need to focus on your homework or let Grandpa rest, sweetie." Each time the door closed, the silence grew heavier, as though the house itself was conspiring to remind him of his place. The transformation was subtle but relentless. He had gone from a father and grandfather to a tolerated presence, a shadow in the corner of their carefully curated lives. He began to notice the way Rachel's eyes slid past him, the way Michael hesitated before inviting him to family outings. Invitations to neighborhood barbecues, once extended, stopped arriving. Birthdays were acknowledged with perfunctory greetings, not celebrations. Even Lily's school events, where once he had cheered from the bleachers, became evenings where he stayed behind, told there weren't enough tickets. He refused to confront them. He understood the power of silence, of letting people reveal themselves through their actions. Each slight, each exclusion became another entry in the ledger hidden beneath his mattress. He wrote it all down, not in bitterness, but in clarity. He knew erasure when he saw it, and he knew that one day the pattern would collapse under its own cruelty. At night, he lay in bed replaying the sound of Margaret's voice. She would not have tolerated this. She would have stormed into the living room, demanded her place, demanded respect. But he was not Margaret. His revenge would not be loud. It would be quiet, deliberate, calculated. He thought of the money that had vanished into debt and luxury, thought of the house he no longer owned, thought of the way his face had disappeared from the walls, and he felt the edges of a plan sharpening. The exclusion was no longer just about dinners or photographs. It was about rewriting history, stripping him of identity, reducing him to nothing. They believed they were winning, that he was powerless. What they didn't realize was that every act of dismissal fueled the fire he kept carefully hidden. They thought they were pushing him out. In truth, they were building the stage for his return, and when it came, it would not be forgotten. The walls of that suburban house carried the weight of their arrogance, and he listened to it, patient as ever, because he knew that the cracks were already forming, and soon they would spread wide enough for him to walk through and claim everything they thought they had erased. And what waited beyond those cracks would leave them more than speechless. It would leave them ruined. The brochures began to appear like weeds in spring. One morning he found a stack on the kitchen counter, their glossy covers shining under the fluorescent light. Smiling seniors in polo shirts and pressed khakis held wine glasses in manicured gardens, their laughter frozen in ink. The name Sunny Hills sprawled across the page in cheerful font, promising comfort and security. He turned one over in his hands, the paper thick and expensive, and wondered how much Rachel had spent just to remind him that he no longer belonged. At first he ignored them. He folded one in half, tucked it under a pile of mail, and told himself it meant nothing. But the next day another appeared. Then another. On the coffee table on his nightstand even slipped into his favorite book, as if she were planting seeds in the soil of his despair. It wasn't suggestion anymore, it was a campaign. Rachel's voice followed the brochures. She dropped hints like crumbs, careful but deliberate. "They have great medical staff, state-of-the-art," she said over breakfast, her fork clinking against the plate. "It's a real community. You'd meet people your own age." She looked at him as though speaking to a child. He sipped his coffee and stayed silent, but inside, something coiled tighter. Michael offered no refuge. When the subject arose, he shifted uneasily in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck. "Dad, maybe she's right," he said one evening, his tone hesitant, almost apologetic. "You'd be more comfortable there, more independent." Independent. The word tasted like ash. They spoke of independence while stripping him of choice. They spoke of comfort while shoving him toward exile. Lily was the only one who noticed the way his jaw tightened when Rachel spoke. She slipped her small hand into his during those conversations, her eyes wide with quiet defiance. "Grandpa doesn't need to go anywhere," she whispered once, but Rachel heard and snapped back. "Go. Do your homework, Lily." The girl obeyed, but not before casting him a look filled with more loyalty than anyone else in that house. The brochures multiplied until they became part of the scenery, like furniture he never chose. He saw them spread across the dining table during dinner, left open on the kitchen island, stuffed into drawers he hadn't touched. Their images taunted him. Pools he would never swim in. Game nights with strangers he would never meet. Smiles that were not his. Each glossy page whispered the same message: "Your time here is almost up." One afternoon he found Rachel in the living room, flipping through one of the brochures with a pen in hand, circling numbers. "Look at these options," she said to Michael, who sat beside her with a glass of scotch. "The deluxe suite even has a balcony. It'll be perfect for him, and the sooner we reserve the better the deal." He stood in the doorway, unseen or simply ignored, listening as his life was reduced to a transaction. He walked back to his room, shut the door, and stared at the ledger under his mattress. The pages were heavy with betrayal, filled with dates and details, lies and debts. Now he added another line: Sunny Hills brochures. He wrote it slowly, deliberately, as though carving it into stone. They believed he was old, weak, and pliable. What they didn't understand was that he was recording every move, every slight, every insult. The ledger wasn't just notes anymore. It was a weapon. That night he dreamed of Margaret. She stood at the edge of their old garden, sunlight falling across her shoulders, her voice steady. "Don't let them bury you before your time," she said. He woke with her words burning in his chest, the faint smell of lavender lingering in the dark. Days passed, and Rachel's campaign grew bolder. She left voicemail messages from the facility sales office playing on speaker. She highlighted lines in the brochures with neon markers. She spoke to Lily within earshot, saying things like, "Your grandpa will make new friends soon, isn't that exciting?" The cruelty wasn't in her words, but in the certainty behind them, as though the decision had already been made. He never argued. He nodded when Michael mumbled about planning for the future. He pretended to study the brochures when Rachel pushed them into his hands. But in the quiet of his room, he prepared. The bungalow by the ocean, the account balances he kept hidden, the trusted realtor who owed him a favor, every detail sharpened in his mind. Rachel thought she was setting a countdown. What she didn't know was that he was counting too, not the days until exile, but the days until revelation. One evening, as rain hammered against the windows, he found himself holding one of the brochures again. The smiling couple on the cover stared back, their joy plastic and empty. He let the paper fall to the floor, the sound sharp in the stillness. He realized then that the brochures were not threats. They were reminders. Reminders that he was surrounded by people who had already written him off, who thought they could erase him with contracts and signatures. The fire inside him no longer felt like grief. It felt like resolve. Each glossy page Rachel placed in front of him only fanned the flames higher. They thought Sunny Hills would be the end of his story. They couldn't imagine that it was just the beginning. And as the storm raged outside, he sat in the darkened room, a faint smile playing at his lips. He knew something they didn't. The countdown wasn't to his departure, it was to theirs. What came after would leave them wishing they had never underestimated him. Lily's presence was the single thread keeping him from unraveling. While Rachel circled brochures and Michael buried himself in work, Lily clung to him with the devotion only a child could give. At 10 years old, she hadn't yet learned the art of exclusion, the cruel efficiency of silence. To her, he wasn't an aging man taking up space. He was Grandpa, the one who told stories that turned rainy afternoons into adventures, the one who still made her laugh with silly voices and exaggerated faces. She filled his room with drawings, each one bright with color, each one heavy with meaning. Crayon sketches of him holding her hand at the park, watercolor streaks of 3 figures standing together on a beach, the waves rolling in soft arcs. She always included Grandma Margaret's smile, wide and unbroken, her hair the same chestnut color it had been when Lily was born. "That's us at the ocean," Lily explained one afternoon, her voice filled with certainty. "You, me, and Grandma, we're together always." He studied the picture, his chest tightening. Margaret had wanted to take Lily to the coast to watch her collect shells and chase seagulls. The trip never happened, but in Lily's art, it was real. Her innocence was a shield against the poison seeping into the house. At night, when Rachel's voice cut through the air with talk of long-term care and better arrangements, Lily would sneak into his room with a flashlight. She curled against him under the blanket, whispering secrets about school, about her dreams of becoming an artist, about how she hated the way her mother looked at him. "Don't listen to her," she said fiercely. "You're not going anywhere. You belong with me." Her conviction was as sharp as any oath, and he clung to it. But innocence is fragile. Rachel noticed the bond and tried to sever it. She pulled Lily away at dinner, redirected her questions, interrupted their stories with chores. "Let Grandpa rest," she repeated like a mantra. Her smile strained her eyes hard. Yet Lily resisted in small ways. She left notes under his pillow, little scraps of paper with messages like, "I love you," or "Don't be sad." She slipped cookies from the kitchen into his pockets when Rachel wasn't looking. She drew Margaret again and again, as though to remind him that love didn't vanish just because a photo was taken off the wall. One evening, as he sat reading in his room, Lily knocked softly before slipping inside. She carried a shoebox wrapped in tissue paper. "It's for you," she said, placing it in his lap. Inside were her treasures: a plastic bracelet, a seashell she had found on a school field trip, a drawing of him standing tall with a cape like a superhero. "It's your box," she whispered, "so you don't forget that you're special." His throat closed, words impossible. He hugged her tightly, breathing in the scent of crayons and shampoo, and for the first time in weeks the weight of betrayal eased. He knew Rachel despised this closeness. He caught her glare once as Lily kissed his cheek goodnight. It was the look of someone who saw loyalty slipping out of her grasp, who feared the unshakable bond between a child and her grandfather. Rachel could erase his photos, hide his belongings, drown the house in brochures, but she couldn't rewrite Lily's love, and that terrified her. The father recognized the danger. He had lived long enough to know that children's innocence was often the first casualty of adult cruelty. He resolved to protect Lily, to shield her from the bitterness creeping through the walls. He began teaching her things Rachel would never approve of: how to keep a secret, how to stay strong when people tried to make you feel small, how silence could sometimes be louder than words. He told her stories not just of the past, but of resilience, of how he and Margaret had built everything from nothing, of how they had endured storms worse than this one. She listened with wide eyes, committing every detail to memory, her loyalty growing deeper. At times he wondered if Margaret had somehow left a piece of herself inside Lily. The girl's laugh carried the same lilt, her stubbornness the same fire. When she clasped his hand, he felt Margaret's presence again, as if his late wife were watching through their granddaughter's eyes, reminding him that love outlasts betrayal. He began to believe that Lily was not just comfort, she was a reason to endure, to plan, to fight quietly until the moment was right. Still, he could see the cracks forming in her innocence. She asked questions no child should have to ask. Why doesn't Mom want you here? Why does Dad look away when you talk? He tried to soften the truth, but her sharp eyes saw through his careful words. She knew she was watching something cruel unfold, even if she didn't understand its depth. That knowledge hardened her, and he grieved for the childhood Rachel was slowly poisoning. Yet her defiance gave him strength. When he looked at Lily, he didn't see a burden or a man fading from relevance. He saw purpose. She anchored him to the present and reminded him that dignity was worth fighting for. Each note she left, each hug, each whispered, "I love you," added fuel to the fire that smoldered within him. The brochures kept multiplying. Rachel's voice grew sharper, Michael more distant. But Lily's love remained untouched, a quiet rebellion against the household's cruelty. It was the one truth they could not erase, the one force they could not bend. And he began to realize that her loyalty wasn't just comfort, it was leverage. Because if Rachel tried to push him out, she would find that Lily's innocence had already chosen sides. And as he tucked one of her drawings into his ledger, hiding it among records of debts and betrayals, he understood something with chilling clarity. Innocence once wounded can become the most powerful weapon of all. What came next would prove that even the smallest voice could topple the cruelest schemes, and it would shake the house to its core. The night of the ultimatum arrived with a chill that seeped through the walls, though the thermostat glowed a steady 72. He knew something was brewing long before they sat down to eat. Rachel had set the table with a precision that felt rehearsed, every fork aligned, every plate gleaming under the chandelier's glow. Michael poured himself a drink before the first bite was taken, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the glass. Lily bounced into her seat with a folder under her arm, her project materials spilling out in a flurry of colored paper and glue sticks. Dinner began in silence, the clatter of silverware masking the tension that hung heavy in the air. He chewed slowly, watching Rachel's eyes dart toward Michael, signaling, waiting for the cue. Finally, halfway through the meal, Michael cleared his throat. "Dad, we've been talking," he began, his voice too measured, too careful. Rachel leaned in, her smile sharp as glass. "We've decided it's time for you to move into Sunny Hills. They've already reserved a space." The words struck like a gavel. He set his fork down, the sound loud in the silence that followed. Before he could answer, Lily's small voice broke through, trembling but fierce. "But Grandpa promised to help me with my project. We're building a model lighthouse together. He can't go." She looked at her father, her eyes pleading her innocence, clashing with the cold verdict that had just been delivered. Rachel's expression hardened, the mask slipping. "Lily, that's enough. Go upstairs." Her tone cracked like a whip, and the little girl froze, tears brimming. But she started again, her voice breaking, but Rachel's hand slammed against the table, rattling the silverware. "Upstairs. Now." The child fled, her footsteps pounding the staircase, her sobs echoing down the hall. He watched her vanish, his chest tightening, his heart tearing, not just for himself, but for her, forced to learn that betrayal could live under her own roof, served at her own dinner table. The silence that followed was worse than the confrontation. Michael looked down, unable to meet his father's eyes. Rachel adjusted her napkin, her expression smug, as if the decision had been signed, sealed, and delivered. He stared at them both, his face calm, though every nerve inside him burned. "I see," he said finally, his voice low but steady. He let the words hang in the air, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Rachel misread his composure as compliance. She leaned back in her chair, sipping her wine. "It's for the best," she said. "You'll be comfortable there and we'll have our space back. Everyone wins. Everyone wins." The phrase rang in his ears, cruel in its simplicity. He had heard it before in boardrooms when men disguised exploitation as opportunity. Now it came from the mouth of his own family, cutting deeper than any deal gone wrong. The rest of the meal played out in hollow motions. Michael cleared his plate without a word. Rachel hummed softly as she checked her phone, and he sat there, his appetite gone, his gaze fixed on the staircase where Lily had disappeared. The house felt smaller than ever, its walls pressing in the weight of betrayal suffocating. When the table was cleared, Rachel excused herself to make a phone call, already discussing next steps with someone on the other end. Michael retreated to his office, the door clicking shut. He was left alone in the dining room, the remnants of dinner scattered like evidence on a crime scene. He rose slowly, his joints stiff but his mind sharper than ever. He walked to the base of the stairs, listening for Lily's muffled sobs from behind her door. "It's all right, sweetheart," he whispered, though he knew she couldn't hear him. His voice was meant more for himself, a promise that this story would not end with him abandoned and her broken. Back in his room, he opened the ledger again. The pages were thick with records. Now money siphoned, lies spun, dignity stolen. Tonight he added another entry. Dinner ultimatum. Rachel's exact words. Michael's silence. Lily's tears. He pressed the pen hard enough to tear the paper. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he let the fury wash over him, not loud, not reckless, but cold and precise. They thought they had cornered him, stripped him of choice, paraded their power in the glow of a chandelier. But they hadn't seen the whole of him yet. They hadn't seen the man who had built fortunes from nothing, who had outlasted storms, who had buried his wife and still stood tall. Rachel believed the brochures were the end of the story, that this ultimatum was the final chapter. She had no idea she was writing the preface to her own downfall. Because betrayal once seen through the eyes of a child cannot be forgotten, and the cracks she created at that dinner table would one day tear the house apart. And as he closed the ledger, his jaw set, his heart steady, he knew the reckoning was closer than they realized. What came next would not just reclaim his dignity. It would expose theirs, and when it did, there would be no hiding from the truth. He did not raise his voice. He did not slam his fists against the table or throw the wineglass that gleamed under the chandelier's light. Instead, he folded his napkin with deliberate care, the fabric crisp in his hands, and placed it beside the untouched plate. The scrape of the chair against the hardwood floor was the only sound he allowed. Years of staring down auditors, of negotiating with men who thought numbers could be twisted into weapons, had taught him that the loudest man in the room was rarely the most dangerous. Rage burned in his chest like a furnace, but on the surface, he was stone. Rachel smirked, mistaking restraint for surrender. Michael glanced up briefly, his eyes searching for signs of collapse, then looked away as though ashamed of what he might find. Neither of them understood what his silence meant. They thought they had won. They thought the old man had finally been broken, folded into compliance. But silence had always been his ally. It gave him time to calculate, to weigh, to plan. He walked slowly from the dining room, each step measured, as if he had simply grown tired of the conversation. In truth, he was cataloging every word, every glance, every betrayal. The house hummed with the aftershocks of the ultimatum, but he refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. In his room, he closed the door gently, sat at his desk, and opened the ledger once again. He wrote down the date, the dinner, the exact phrasing Rachel had used, even the way Michael's hand had trembled slightly when holding his glass. Evidence, all of it. Not for the courts, not yet, but for himself, a record of the rot spreading through the family he had built. As he set the pen down, he caught sight of Lily's latest drawing taped to the wall. The lighthouse stood tall in her sketch, its beam cutting through storm clouds, guiding lost ships home. He traced the outline with his fingertip and felt his pulse steady. That was what he needed to be now, not the storm, but the light slicing through it. The following days he wore silence like armor. When Rachel left more brochures on his nightstand, he smiled faintly and tucked them away without comment. When Michael muttered about transition timelines over breakfast, he nodded as though he were listening, his eyes betraying nothing. Inside, every detail was filed away, every slight sharpening the blade he kept hidden. He noticed how Rachel grew unsettled by his composure. She thrived on confrontation, on the satisfaction of watching him crack. But when his calm refused to bend, she shifted tactics. "It's for his own good," she told neighbors on the porch, her voice dripping with concern. "He just can't admit he needs help." He overheard, his face unreadable, but his mind took note. She was laying the groundwork, crafting the narrative of a frail old man too stubborn to see reality. Let her. Every false word she spread only widened the chasm between appearance and truth, and when the truth surfaced, the fall would be brutal. At night, he sat by the window, the hum of the neighborhood fading into the distance, and rehearsed possibilities. He could leave quietly, retreat to the bungalow he had secured by the sea, vanish before they realized the power they thought they wielded had slipped from their grasp. But part of him wanted more. Part of him wanted them to feel what he had felt at that dinner table. The humiliation, the cold dismissal, the certainty that their choices no longer mattered. He began to move pieces subtly, the way he once shifted numbers on complex tax filings, invisible to those who didn't know where to look. Phone calls made when the house was empty. Documents tucked into envelopes, sealed and hidden. Conversations with old contacts Rachel and Michael had forgotten he even had. To them, he was fading. In reality, he was constructing something stronger than rage, a plan rooted in patience. Lily noticed his quiet strength. She asked one evening why he wasn't angry, why he didn't shout like she wanted him to. He smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Sometimes, he told her, the strongest answer is silence. It gives people enough rope to hang themselves. She didn't fully understand, but she nodded, trusting him as she always had. Rachel mistook his calm for weakness, but Michael began to sense something beneath it. There were moments when their eyes met across the table, and for a fraction of a second Michael looked uneasy, as if he knew his father wasn't retreating but waiting. That hesitation told him everything he needed to know. Michael was not entirely blind to the danger, but fear of Rachel's disapproval kept him chained. Each morning he rose earlier, his routine steady, his demeanor unshaken. He made coffee, read the newspaper, and asked about Lily's school with the same measured tone. It was ordinary, almost painfully so, but within that ordinariness was defiance. They expected collapse. Instead, they got consistency. They expected fire. Instead, they got ice. And beneath that ice, the fire only grew hotter. His silence was no longer just a shield, it was a weapon sharpening itself against the grindstone of betrayal. Every calm nod, every polite smile, every quiet retreat from confrontation was another strike he withheld, saving it for the moment it would cut deepest. The house, once suffocating, became his stage. He could feel it in the way Rachel grew impatient, snapping at Michael, raising her voice more often. The cracks were spreading. Michael's shoulders sagged under the weight of decisions he no longer fully controlled. Lily clung tighter, sensing change but not yet understanding. And he, the man they had dismissed, stood at the center of it all, calm as stone, watching, waiting. Because he knew the reckoning would not come with shouts or slammed doors. It would come in silence, delivered with the precision of a lifetime spent turning chaos into order. And when it came, they would never forget the man they thought they had silenced. The man whose quiet had always been louder than their cruelty. The man who had waited until the perfect moment to strike. What waited just beyond their sight was no longer patience. It was inevitability. And when the moment arrived, it would shatter the illusion they had built, leaving them exposed to a truth they could neither control nor contain. The plan had begun long before Rachel's brochures cluttered the counters, before Michael's silence hardened into complicity. He had always known that to survive in a world that fed on the weak, one needed to keep something hidden. Over the years, as Rachel and Michael bled him of money with polished excuses and hollow promises, he had quietly siphoned away what remained of his strength, his savings. Each check deposited into an account no one else knew existed. Each investment made under a name only Thomas, his oldest friend, could connect back to him. Thomas had been with him through the lean years back when they were both young men chasing futures larger than their paychecks. Now, decades later, Thomas was more than a realtor. He was a confidant, one of the last people alive who remembered Margaret's laugh and the stubborn determination in her eyes. Over coffee one afternoon, he had leaned across the table and whispered, "You still have options, you know." And that was all it took. A seed planted, a door cracked open. When Rachel began circling the glossy brochures with her pen, he was already 10 steps ahead. While she pushed her narrative of sunny hills, he was wiring payments for a bungalow nestled near the ocean, its porch wide enough to hold a rocking chair, its windows positioned to catch the sunrise every morning. The house wasn't large, not compared to the one Rachel guarded like a throne, but it was his. No one could erase his photos from its walls. No one could hide his books in cardboard boxes. No one could tell him when to eat or where to sleep. He could still smell the salt air from the last time he had stood on that stretch of beach, Margaret's hand in his. They had spoken about retiring there, about filling their days with the sound of waves and the laughter of grandchildren. Margaret never lived to see it, but the dream had remained. Now it wasn't just a dream, it was a weapon. Every phone call with Thomas was cloaked in secrecy. He spoke in low tones when the house was empty, the blinds drawn, his words precise and deliberate. "Keep it quiet," he told him. "Not a word to anyone. Not even your assistant." Thomas understood. He was a man who had lived long enough to know the value of discretion. At night, in the silence of his room, he allowed himself to picture it. The bungalow's hardwood floors, the kitchen with its chipped tiles that reminded him of the one he and Margaret had once shared, the porch that faced the endless horizon. Freedom wrapped in cedar shingles and ocean breeze. It was more than an escape. It was a declaration. Meanwhile, the house he lived in grew more hostile. Rachel grew bolder, Michael more withdrawn. Lily clung tighter, her innocence bruised but not yet broken. He played the role of the compliant old man, nodding when spoken to, smiling faintly when shown another brochure. But beneath that facade, the gears of his plan turned steadily. Every detail was accounted for. He had arranged for the utilities to be switched into his name, the deed secured the locks ready to change. He even kept a suitcase packed in the back of his closet filled with the essentials, Margaret's rosary, his ledger, Lily's drawings, and just enough clothing to step into his new life without looking back. There was a strange satisfaction in watching Rachel celebrate her supposed victory. She believed her campaign was working, that each brochure pushed him closer to submission. Michael, too, seemed relieved, as if the problem of his father could be solved with a signature on a nursing home contract. They whispered about timelines, about making the transition smooth. He heard every word, memorized every phrase, and tucked it into the ledger. They thought they were plotting his confinement. They had no idea they were digging their own grave. Lily remained his anchor, her drawings tucked between the ledger's pages like talismans. He promised himself she would see the bungalow one day, that she would know her grandfather wasn't erased, wasn't forgotten, wasn't silenced. She would walk with him along the shore, chasing the same gulls her grandmother once dreamed of. That vision fueled him, strengthened his resolve when the weight of betrayal threatened to crush him. Patience had become his greatest weapon. He waited, not rushing, not revealing. He knew timing mattered more than force. If he left too soon, Rachel would spin her story of the stubborn old man who couldn't adapt. If he confronted them too directly, Michael would hide behind her shadow. No, his departure had to be perfect. It had to be silent, decisive, and irreversible. In the evenings, he would sit by the window, the brochures piled neatly on his desk, untouched. He would turn one over glance at the grinning faces frozen in artificial joy and let himself smile. They thought they were sending him there. They thought the decision was made. And yet, just miles away, the keys to his future were already waiting. The house no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a stage, and every act Rachel performed, every lie Michael swallowed, only heightened the anticipation of the final scene. They were actors, reading lines from a script they thought they had written. But the script in his hands told a different story, one where the ending belonged to him alone. And as he lay in bed, the suitcase hidden just feet away, he could almost hear the waves crashing against the shore of his new home. Soon, he thought. Very soon. Because while they plotted his exile, he was preparing his return not as the burden they imagined, but as the man they had underestimated for far too long. What they would discover when the moment came was that freedom was not something granted. It was something taken back quietly, ruthlessly, without apology. And when the curtain finally fell, they would be left staring into the emptiness of their own making, while he stood on the porch of his bungalow, breathing in the salt air of a life reclaimed. The last dinner unfolded like theater, each movement heavy with meaning. Rachel set the table with that smug precision, her silver bracelets clinking as though announcing victory. Michael sat stiff in his chair, hiding behind his glass of bourbon, while Lily poked at her food, her eyes swollen from crying earlier. The old man ate slowly, tasting nothing, cataloging everything. He let them believe they had won, that his silence was surrender, that the brochures scattered through the house had beaten him into compliance. Rachel's laughter was sharp, her voice sweetened with triumph as she spoke of finalizing arrangements. He nodded once, offering nothing more. When the plates were cleared, he excused himself with quiet dignity. No raised voice, no protest, no crack in his composure. He walked back to his room, closed the door, and sat in the dark. The ledger lay open on the desk, its pages swollen with betrayal. He added one final line. Last Supper, Sunny Hills, Rachel victorious. Michael silent. Lily broken. Then he closed it, slid it into his suitcase, and locked it tight. The bag was already packed. Clothes folded with military precision. Margaret's rosary tucked safely inside Lily's drawings, nestled between the shirts. The preparation had been finished weeks ago. Tonight was only confirmation. He rose before dawn, the house heavy with sleep. The SUV sat gleaming in the driveway, the monument to his stolen money, its chrome catching the faintest trace of moonlight. He did not look back at it. Instead, he lifted his suitcase steady in his hand and walked to the curb where a cab idled. Thomas had arranged everything. Keys, deed, utilities, all in his name. Freedom was not waiting. Freedom was already his. The ride to the coast was silent but not empty. He watched the suburbs blur into open road, the houses shrinking in the rearview mirror. Every mile was another layer of weight peeling off his chest. By the time the first streaks of sunrise bled across the horizon, the bitterness had cooled into resolve. Ahead lay the ocean, vast and endless, a horizon Margaret once dreamed of. Behind him lay betrayal, shrinking into nothing but a cautionary tale. The bungalow stood exactly as he remembered. It weathered but proud, the salt air clinging to its cedar siding. The realtor had been true to his word. Stocked fridge, clean sheets, the porch swept clear. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and inhaled deeply. No Rachel. No brochures. No photographs erased from walls. Only space that was his, every corner whispering of peace rather than contempt. He set the suitcase down, ran his hand along the wooden frame of the doorway, and let the sound of waves crashing outside replace the hollow silence of his son's house. For the first time in months, he brewed coffee that tasted of freedom. He stood on the porch, mug in hand, watching gulls cut across the pale sky. Margaret's rosary sat in his pocket, the beads warm against his palm, and he imagined her smile in the wind. He had not been exiled. He had not been erased. He had chosen this. Back at Michael's house, the discovery would be brutal. They would wake to find his room empty. The bed neatly made, the brochures stacked untouched on the nightstand. No note, no explanation, only absence. Rachel would rage, demanding answers, her voice slicing through the air. Michael would search the drawers, the closet, the garage, looking for clues, but find none. And Lily, sweet, loyal Lily, would know the truth. She would find the missing drawings from his desk, remember the stories he whispered, and understand. He had not abandoned her. He had shown her that dignity is not surrendered, even when others conspire to strip it away. He pictured Rachel's fury, her world tilting, as she realized she had never been in control. She had pushed him toward a nursing home, certain of her triumph, and instead he had walked into a life she could never touch. Michael's silence, his complicity, would weigh heavier now. Without his father to absorb the blame, he would stand alone beneath Rachel's fire. The cracks in their perfect suburban facade would spread. That house, once smug in its cruelty, would soon feel like a prison of their own making. He did not need to witness it. He did not crave their downfall with gloating eyes. His revenge was quieter, sharper. It was the image of their empty dining chair, the realization that the man they had dismissed as powerless had slipped from their grasp, reclaiming everything they tried to steal. Revenge was not a shout. It was the absence of sound, the silence of a door closed forever. As the sun climbed higher, he walked down to the shore, his feet sinking into the damp sand. The waves rolled in steady and relentless, carrying away the bitterness with every crash. He thought of Lily, of the day she would visit, of showing her the lighthouse sketches come to life against the horizon. He thought of Margaret. Her laughter carried in the breeze, her dream finally made real. He smiled not with triumph, but with peace. Rachel had been right. It had been his last dinner in that house, but not because they had won, because he had chosen to leave before their cruelty could cage him. The difference was everything. They had plotted his end. Instead, he had written a new beginning. And as he turned back toward the bungalow, the waves echoing behind him, he knew the story was far from over. The reckoning he had set in motion would ripple outward, reaching Rachel, Michael, even Lily, in ways they could not yet imagine. They believed they had silenced him. In truth, he had only just found his voice. Life often tests dignity in ways that cut deeper than we expect. In this story, a father was betrayed by those closest to him, treated as a burden instead of a blessing. Yet instead of answering cruelty with anger, he chose silence, patience, and careful preparation. His quiet strength became the foundation of his freedom, reminding us that even when others try to erase our worth, we still hold the power to define our own ending. For older generations, the lesson is clear. Never underestimate your ability to reclaim control, no matter your age. Self-respect and independence are treasures no one can take unless you surrender them. And sometimes the most powerful revenge is not confrontation. It's living well with peace, dignity, and the knowledge that you chose your own path. If this message resonates with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever faced a moment where silence was your greatest strength? Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful life lessons and stories that honor the wisdom of experience. Your journey and your voice matters.